It was raining when Maya Carter was humiliated for the first time that night, and she would not realize until later that it would not be the last. The seafood diner on 8th Avenue was almost empty that Tuesday, soaked in neon reflections and the quiet exhaustion of late shift workers. Maya moved between tables with aching feet and a practiced smile that no longer belonged to her. She had been working since noon, had skipped dinner, and her phone in her apron pocket still showed 3 unanswered calls from the hospital. Her mother's heart medication was running out again. She did not know how she would pay for it this time. When the man in the charcoal suit walked in, the room shifted. Not with noise, but with gravity. He did not look rich in the loud way tourists did. He looked rich the way storms do before they break. Calm, heavy, inevitable. He sat in her section. Maya approached with her notepad and gave him the same smile she gave everyone. He ordered the cheapest item on the menu and a black coffee. No questions, no small talk. She noticed his hands when she poured the coffee. Clean, steady. A man used to being obeyed. She walked away uneasy. 20 minutes later, a group of drunken traders stumbled in from the bar across the street and dropped into the booth beside him. They were loud crude, already laughing like the night owed them something. When Maya refilled their drinks, one of them grabbed her wrist and said something that made her stomach drop. She froze. The diner went quiet in that terrible way where everyone hears but pretends they do not. Before she could pull away, the man in the charcoal suit stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch the trader. He simply placed his hand between them and said quietly that the game ended now. Something in his eyes made them laugh nervously and let go. They muttered apologies into their beers. Maya did not thank him. She could not. Pride and fear tangled in her throat. When she returned to his table later, her hands were shaking. Their eyes met. For a moment, the noise of the city disappeared. She felt seen and hated it. 40 minutes passed. He did not touch his food. The traders staggered out. Maya cleared plates and avoided his gaze. When he finally stood to leave, she followed him to the register. $8.50. He paid with a black card that did not leave the machine long enough to question it. She handed him the receipt. He signed it without looking at her. He turned and walked into the rain without a word. Maya picked up the slip. The tip line was blank, 0. It hit her harder than the trader's grip. She felt stupid for the way her heart had jumped when he defended her. Rich men did not protect girls like her for free. The sting spread fast. Behind her, the other servers whispered. She forced her back straight and went to clear his table. That was when she found the folded note beneath the edge of his untouched plate. Her name was written on it in careful ink. Maya. Her breath caught. Inside the note were only 2 lines. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Atlas Group Tower. Ask for Lucas Blackwood. Beneath that were 3 words that confused her more than the 0 tip ever could. This is not pity. Her knees went weak. Atlas Group was one of the most powerful companies in New York. Lucas Blackwood was the billionaire who built half the skyline with green glass and impossible ambition. Maya stuffed the note into her apron like it might disappear if she hesitated. Outside, the rain thickened. She finished her shift in a daze. At the hospital, her mother slept under dim lights and quiet machines. Maya counted the bills in her purse. $13. She brushed her mother's hair and whispered lies about everything being fine. that night she did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and felt the ghost of his hand still between her and the traitor. The 0 tip felt like a blade, the note felt like a heartbeat, and the space between those two things felt dangerous enough to change her life forever. The sun rose over Brooklyn, like it always did, indifferent to the quiet storms inside Maya Carter's chest, and the city began moving again as if nothing in her life had shifted irrevocably the night before, but everything had, even if she did not yet have the courage to name it. She had fallen asleep only as dawn cracked the blinds, still dressed in yesterday's diner uniform, the folded note hidden beneath her pillow like a secret she both feared and needed. The hospital called at 7:30 to remind her about the balance on her mother's account. The polite voice on the line practiced in reminding people that survival required numbers. Maya listened, whispered, "Yes, I understand," and ended the call before her throat could betray her. Her mother had been a cleaner her entire life, burned out her body so that Maya and her younger brother Jonah would never feel like scraps of the world. The problem was that the world had never stopped treating them that way anyway. Maya showered quickly in water that never quite turned hot, pulled on jeans with a frayed waistband, and braided her hair with fingers that trembled more than she wanted to admit. She checked the envelope from the pharmacy on the table and the unopened electric bill beside it, then tucked the note from Lucas Blackwood into the pocket of her jacket, like it was something fragile and alive. On the subway, she watched people in pressed suits scroll through phones that cost more than 3 months of her rent, and she told herself she hated them for how easy they made it look. She told herself she hated the man who had defended her last night and still left nothing behind but a 0 and a mystery. Atlas Group Tower rose out of Midtown like the spine of a new god, all mirrored sky and arrogant geometry. And Maya stood across the street for nearly 10 minutes, telling herself she would turn around before anyone inside ever learned her name. She had learned not to want things because wanting made the fall hurt worse. By the time she crossed the street, her hands were numb even in her pockets. The lobby swallowed her in cold light and silent money, and the woman at the reception desk did not hide the flicker of assessment in her eyes when Maya gave the name Lucas Blackwood, with a voice that sounded too small to belong in that room. The elevator ride felt endless, each rising number tightening the knot in her stomach, until it felt like something might finally snap. While she rode upward, memories rose with her, whether she welcomed them or not. Flashes of a childhood where asking had always been followed by disappointment, where promises were thin and breakable things that never survived contact with bills and late notices. Her father had once asked a corporate supervisor for extra shifts. After an injury sidelined him for months, and 2 weeks later he had been laid off entirely, a liability quietly erased. That was the first time Maya learned that asking was dangerous. When the doors opened onto glass hallways and hushed efficiency, she almost turned back, but the note in her pocket felt heavier with every step forward. He met her in a small conference room that overlooked nothing but a neighboring brick wall, as if even the building itself did not yet trust her with a view. Lucas Blackwood did not rise immediately when she entered. He studied her as if the night before had not been some isolated curiosity, but a continuation of something he had been watching unfold for much longer than she understood. She hated the way her pulse betrayed her when their eyes met again. It was not desire, she told herself, it was fear dressed up as awareness. He offered her coffee, and she refused on instinct because accepting felt too much like the beginning of owing. He smiled faintly at that, as if he had expected it. He spoke first, and his voice was calm enough to make her nervous, explaining the test, the zero tip, the reason he had sat in that booth long enough to learn her rhythms and silences. Maya listened without interrupting, her spine rigid, her pride flaring hotter with every sentence, until he finished and offered her a job that sounded like a cruel joke told at her expense. $85,000, benefits, flexible hours, and a role in a new community development project that made her feel suddenly very young and very tired. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, and asked him if humiliating women in diners was his idea of charity now. He did not flinch. He told her he was not interested in charity and never had been. He wanted someone who did not collapse under the weight of being unseen. Maya stood so abruptly, her chair tipped backward, and she told him he had no idea what it cost to survive when no one was looking. He answered that he knew precisely because someone like her mother had once taught him, though he did not yet give her the full story. She left without saying yes or no, walked back onto the street, and felt the city slam into her with heat and noise and speed that made her feel impossibly small again. She rode the subway home with tears she refused to let fall, and sat at her mother's bedside like she always did, counting breaths and pretending the machines were nothing more than stubborn clocks. When Jonah burst into the room after school with a suspension notice clenched in his fist for defending another kid from getting jumped, Maya felt the world tilt in a new, sharper way. Because courage seemed to be the only inheritance her family ever passed down, and it was also the thing that cost them the most. That night she worked another shift at the diner and moved like she was underwater, replaying Lucas Blackwood's voice in her head, even as she told herself she wanted to forget it. The traitors did not return. No one grabbed her wrist. No one defended her either. When the rush died down, she stood alone at the counter, wiping the same space over and over, as if repetition could scrub uncertainty away. She took out the note again and unfolded it one more time, tracing the sharp certainty of the handwriting with a finger that felt suddenly very tired. This is not pity. She had spent her entire life refusing pity because it came with strings stitched so thin you only saw them when they tightened. But what frightened her most was not the money Lucas had offered, not the glass towers and silent elevators, not even the possibility that she could fail spectacularly if she tried to step into a world that had chewed up her father. What frightened her most was the flicker of another feeling she had not invited and did not trust, the inconvenient warmth that had spread through her chest when he placed himself between her and harm without asking what it would cost him. She had built her life on endurance rather than hope, because hope made too many promises it never kept. And yet, in the quiet between orders and excuses and hospital alarms, the thought that someone like Lucas Blackwood had seen her and chosen to speak her name aloud would not leave her alone. Maya Carter had learned how to survive by never asking for more than the day required, but now the idea that the world might demand something from her instead was knocking far louder than she wanted to admit, and for the first time in years, the question was not how she would endure tomorrow, but whether she had the right to want anything beyond it. Lucas Blackwood had not believed in love since the night it broke him open on a rain-slick highway outside Hartford. The night sirens painted the dark in violent colors, and the woman he had planned to marry slipped out of the world before he could learn how to beg properly. And since then, every success built on top of that loss had felt like a monument to something hollowed out rather than earned. On the morning Maya walked into Atlas Group and walked back out again with fire in her eyes and refusal in every step, Lucas sat alone in his office long after his assistants stopped pretending they were busy staring at the city through glass that never reflected anything back at him clearly enough to touch. He told himself it was control that unsettled him most about her, the fact that she had not bowed, not softened, not reshaped herself to fit the outcome he had offered. But that was only a partial truth, one he could admit to safely without confronting the deeper fracture beneath it. The deeper truth was that in the diner he had seen something he had not allowed himself to want in years, and once seen it would not be unseen. He had grown up in those same kinds of late-night places where exhaustion sat heavier than the smell of coffee, and everyone learned to count kindness in small increments, because there was never enough to go around. His mother had worked 3 jobs after his father died, her hands always rough, her eyes always watchful, and the man she became most afraid of disappointing had not been the landlord or the bill collectors, but her own child asleep on a couch that never felt like it belonged to them. Lucas learned early that survival demanded control, that love was a luxury for people who could afford to fail more than once. When the other kids at school joked about what they wanted to be when they grew up, Lucas had wanted only one thing: to never need anyone ever again. And he had pursued that goal with the ruthless clarity of a boy who could not afford confusion. Building Atlas Group from nothing had not been an act of vision. The way journalists romanticized it, it had been an act of defense, a wall, tall enough to keep grief from reaching him again. His fiancée had shattered that illusion in an instant he still relived in pieces rather than as a whole. The curve of her smile before the car skidded the crack of impact, the ferocious absence afterward where her voice had lived only seconds before. After the funeral, he had learned to answer condolences with precision, and to sleep alone with a precision that frightened people who did not know how necessary it had become to him. He dated because men like him were expected to, but the women he met were always searching for echoes in him that no longer existed, and he found himself irritated by their hope in ways that felt unkind even to his own memory. When Maya appeared behind that counter with tired grace and a spine bowed only by necessity, something old and dangerous stirred against the walls he had spent a decade building, and he had responded to it the only way he knew how, by testing it. The 0 tip had been cruelty, disguised as clarity. A scalpel stroke meant to reveal what lay under politeness. When expectation was stripped away, and her refusal to flinch when she thought he was nothing more than another indifferent wealthy stranger had unsettled him in ways that even he could not fully account for. When she stormed out of his office with her anger bright and unmasked, the city seemed suddenly loud in a way it had not been minutes earlier. And for the rest of that day, Lucas moved through meetings and calls as if there were a misaligned note in the background of every conversation. something sour he could not tune out. He had ordered background checks on her that afternoon. With the same efficiency, he applied to potential acquisitions, expecting a thin file with little more than overdue bills and part-time employment. But the life that unfolded on his screen had not been as simple as poverty often looked from a distance. Maya Carter did not drift. She held her family together with an effort that bordered on violence against her own limits, skipping education. Not because she lacked ambition, but because ambition rarely paid pharmacy invoices in cash. He learned about her father's lawsuit that had gone nowhere, about the quiet bitterness that had settled into that household after hope proved too expensive, about the brother who shared her stubbornness and her mother's failing heart. By the time Lucas set the file aside, he felt the slow weight of responsibility pressing against parts of himself he had long declared closed. He told himself again that this was not desire, not even attraction, but recognition, a mirror held up to a version of his past he had escaped and never quite mourned. Yet that night, when he returned to the empty apartment that loomed over Central Park like an expensive shell, it was Maya's face that followed him through mirror after mirror. Not the familiar ghosts of deals gone wrong or rivals defeated. He drank a single glass of whiskey. He did not finish standing in a room too clean to reveal anything about him that might bleed, and considered breaking the rule he had made after the accident, the rule that said he would never again move toward someone who could be taken from him. The hospital administrator called later to confirm the anonymous donor coverage for cardiac medication for a patient named Elena Carter, and Lucas ended the call with his pulse louder than he liked. Unsure whether he had acted from impulse or intent, he justified it easily in the silence that followed, telling himself that he funded causes without faces every day, that this was no different, but the lie tasted weak the moment Jonah Carter's scholarship paperwork crossed his desk 3 days later. That had not been part of any system. That had been him. By the time Maya learned about it through channels she would not later be able to trace, Lucas had already decided he would accept whatever storm followed as the price of having acted without permission. When the media sting eventually came, it would feel inevitable rather than surprising. But in the days that preceded it, he began to find himself watching the diner's corner booth through traffic cameras he did not technically need access to for personal reasons, watching the rhythm of Maya's shifts, the way some men checked the weather, not to control it, but to know whether the sky was still where he had seen it last. He noticed the way her shoulders tensed in anticipation of being touched, and the way she softened in rare moments of laughter with coworkers who did not yet carry the poison that attention would later bring. And each observation lodged itself somewhere he did not know how to catalog. Lucas Blackwood had built an empire on the belief that detachment made him unbreakable, and yet without warning, he was beginning to sense cracks forming in the deepest places of that armor. Cracks shaped uncomfortably, like a woman who had refused his protection and received it anyway. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to imagine the possibility of loss, not as a warning but as a consequence he might be willing to risk, and that realization frightened him more than any collapse of stock or reputation ever had. He did not yet call it love, did not allow the word traction in his head, but the quiet rewriting of his internal map had already begun, and somewhere between her anger and her endurance, something in him had started to believe, against every rule he had lived by, since grief taught him discipline, that the most dangerous thing he could do now was not to feel again, but to keep pretending that he no longer could. The second time Maya Carter walked into the world of glass, she did not do it with the trembling disbelief of a girl who had been summoned by miracle, but with the rigid composure of someone who had already decided nothing inside those walls belonged to her. Not the floors that mirrored the skyline, not the soft voices that floated through corridors like curated music, and certainly not the man who had learned her life from a file and altered it without permission. She nearly turned back twice before the revolving door carried her forward, each rotation a reminder that this building swallowed people whole and spat them out rearranged. The receptionist did not recognize her this time, which hurt more than it should have, as if being remembered for one brief moment had been a kind of fragile privilege now rescinded. But when Maya said her name and the word meeting a call was placed, and the expression behind the desk shifted in a way that made it clear even to a girl who had never belonged in rooms like this, that status here obeyed rules she had not been taught, the elevator rose silently, her reflection pale and stiff against mirrored walls that returned no mercy, and with every rising number, her resolve felt less like strength and more like the last thin line holding back a flood. Lucas did not meet her in the small conference room this time. He met her in the main boardroom, a long table of polished dark wood, flanked by faces that were practiced in dismissal and power men and women who had been trained for decades to smile without revealing any intention that might cost them leverage later. Maya felt their eyes weight her from head to toe, measuring cost, worth, and usefulness in the same breath. Her outfit was clean but unmistakably second-hand. Her shoes worn at the heel, her hands too calloused for the illusions. This room traded in, and yet she lifted her chin and stood where the assistant indicated without apology, because there was nothing left in her life that had not already been evaluated and found insufficient at least once. Lucas sat at the far end of the table and did not look at her immediately. And for a moment Maya wondered if this was the punishment. She had walked into a performance where she would be discussed rather than addressed. But when she finally met his eyes, something shifted in the atmosphere that not even the room's practiced indifference could mask. His gaze did not soften, but it steadied like a hand placed at the small of her back, without touching a promise of balance rather than possession. The board began speaking in numbers and projections, and reputational language that flattened her into an idea rather than a person, and she felt the familiar old instinct rise in her to shrink, to accept that she did not belong, and to leave without making a sound, but her body would not obey it this time. One of the directors cleared his throat and asked Lucas whether it was appropriate for a diner waitress with no formal degree to be present in a discussion involving million-dollar outreach initiatives, and Maya felt heat rise up her neck before she could stop it. Humiliation arriving ahead of reason the way it always did. She opened her mouth to excuse herself the way she had been trained to, but Lucas stood before any sound could escape her. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the moment. He simply said that she was present because he had invited her, and that if the room had a problem with that, they could take it up with him instead of turning a woman into a talking point. The silence that followed landed hard and wide, and in it Maya understood what it meant to be protected by someone whose protection carried institutional weight rather than just personal risk. The director tried to redirect the discussion back into safer abstractions, but Lucas did not sit down again right away, and that alone unsettled the rhythm the board depended on. He said Maya Carter had not come to be evaluated today, but to see with her own eyes what power looked like when it pretended to be neutral, and that if she chose to leave after that, he would not stop her. The honesty of that declaration struck her harder than any offer or apology could have, because for the first time in a room full of people who could unmake her with a quiet vote, someone had named her autonomy out loud. When they finally dismissed her from the boardroom with politeness, sharpened into something close to warning, Maya walked back into the hall with her heart pounding violently enough to make her dizzy, and Lucas followed her without ceremony, as if the corridor belonged equally to both of them, despite the difference in keys they carried. They stopped near the window that overlooked nothing meaningful, just a sliver of the city's less curated edge, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Maya broke first because silence in rooms like this felt like surrender. She told him he had humiliated her again, this time in public, by making her into a spectacle for people who traded in optics the way she traded in tips, and that his defense had not erased that fact. Lucas did not interrupt her. He listened the way a man listens when he intends to remember rather than argue, and when she finished, he said he had not defended her to look righteous, but because the room had crossed a line he could not allow to endure. He told her he had grown up watching his mother absorb the same quiet erosions of worth, until she carried them the way others carried purses always within reach and never truly empty. The confession did not come out rehearsed. It felt like something he had not planned to say, until the words forced themselves into space where they could not be taken back. Maya wanted to reject it on reflex, to fling his history back at him, as another story rich men used to make themselves tolerable, but something in the tension of his jaw stopped her. It was not pity she saw there, it was memory. He told her again that the job was real, that the funding was secure, and that no one in that building would touch a dollar of it without going through him first. She asked him why, her not gently, but with the sharpness of someone who had learned that unanswered questions always turned into traps. Lucas hesitated, just enough to make the moment dangerous, and said, because when he tested her, she had not tried to earn his favor or punish his indifference. She had simply endured it and kept moving, and that endurance had felt like a language he had almost forgotten how to speak. The words lodged somewhere uncomfortable and warm in Maya's chest, and she hated that part of herself for responding to them at all. She told him endurance was not a virtue, where she came from it was a requirement, and that he did not get to turn survival into something poetic. He accepted the rebuke without deflection. When she turned to leave the building for the second time in as many days, with no agreement signed and no certainty reclaimed, Lucas walked with her all the way to the lobby. This time the tension between them threaded with things neither of them was yet willing to name. Outside the city roared back into her body the moment the door slid open, but before she could disappear into the current of strangers, Lucas said her name with something dangerously close to urgency. Maya turned, for a breath that felt too long for propriety, and too short for consequence. They stood there suspended between everything that had already changed and everything that was about to. He did not ask her to trust him. He asked her to decide for herself whether the life she was defending could afford not to take the risk he was offering. Then he let her go without another word. Maya rode the subway back to Brooklyn with his question pressed hard against her ribs, replaying the moment he had stood in that room and spoken for her when every old instinct had told her she was alone. She told herself again that protection was a transaction and that men with power never gave it without collecting something later. But the memory of the way he had looked at her when he said her name would not resolve into the shape of a lie, no matter how stubbornly she tried to force it. By the time she reached the block where her mother waited in a hospital bed, tethered to machines that answered only to money, Maya understood that the world of glass had not merely watched her pass through it. Unaltered, it had seen her and refused to allow her to leave without taking some of it with her, and that realization terrified her far more than any explicit rejection ever could. Love did not arrive for Maya Carter as a confession or a grand promise, but as the slow, unrelenting realization that someone had begun to stand between her and the world without asking permission or demanding repayment, and that the space he created around her felt dangerously like safety. The first time she understood this was not when Lucas Blackwood called her with another offer. She was prepared to refuse, but when her manager at the diner slammed a final paycheck onto the counter and told her the owner had decided her presence was becoming a liability. No explanation followed that statement because none was needed. The whispers had already reached the late crowd, the rumors already blooming into ugly shapes that bent her name into something gaudy and transactional. Maya stood there in the same uniform she had worn the night the zero tip split her life in two, and for a moment she could not remember how to breathe without shame. When she stepped outside into the alley with the thin envelope trembling in her hand, her phone rang. It was Lucas. She almost did not answer out of pure stubborn instinct, but something inside her broke loose and forced the call through. He did not speak at first. He listened. She told him she had been fired. She did not accuse him. She did not ask for help. She merely stated a fact and ended the call before he could turn that fact into an intervention. 30 minutes later, as she waited for the bus with nowhere in particular to go, a black car slid to the curb with an inevitability that felt almost predatory. His driver stepped out first, but it was Lucas who opened the passenger door for her without waiting for agreement or defiance. She refused at first, her voice sharp with humiliation, but when the driver discreetly handed her a packet of papers that showed the date and time someone had paid off her diner's outstanding debts anonymously, 3 weeks earlier, something in her resistance finally collapsed. She got into the car without another word. Lucas did not touch her. He did not apologize. He simply told her that she would not be sleeping on a stranger's couch or walking 10 miles home with nowhere certain to land tonight. Protection, she understood then, was not always loud. It was sometimes just the quiet refusal to let someone fall alone. The second time she felt the shape of it was at the hospital, when an insurance denial arrived with bureaucratic finality that made Elena Carter's surgery suddenly a luxury rather than a necessity. Maya stood at the nurse's station, arguing with a calm that frightened even herself. watching the familiar pattern unfold where urgency dissolved beneath policy language. Before she could break inside that slow-motion helplessness, Lucas appeared at her side without notice, his presence slicing through the administrative haze in a way hers never could. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten. He simply placed a hand on the counter and said that the billing department could either correct the oversight now or discuss it later with legal counsel and a press team already waiting in the lobby. The surgery was approved within 12 minutes. When Maya followed him into the hallway, she did not thank him. She accused him of buying her dignity with leverage. He answered that dignity was not something he believed in buying at all, only in refusing to let it be negotiated away. That night she sat by her mother's bed and felt something shift inside her chest that could no longer be named simple gratitude. The third time came when Jonah's suspension escalated into an expulsion hearing under the thin excuse of repeated disruption, a phrase that translated easily into the truth that a scholarship boy without a powerful last name came standard with expendable margins. Maya stood in the school office, staring down educators who spoke to her with polished sympathy and sharpened conclusions, and she felt the familiar exhaustion of fighting systems that smiled while they erased you. Lucas did not enter that room like a conqueror. He entered like a witness who refused to look away. He never mentioned his wealth. He never mentioned Atlas Group. He spoke only about the pattern of behavior in Jonah's file, the disciplinary discrepancies compared to his peers, and the consequences of removing a student whose only crime was a reflex toward defense. In a world that rewarded aggression disguised as confidence. When the hearing ended with Jonah reinstated and a formal apology the district had not intended to issue, Maya finally scrubbed her face in the bathroom and allowed herself to cry in a way that had nothing to do with despair. Love, she realized, was beginning to feel like a series of small rescues that arrived before she knew how to ask for them. Yet even as her dependence on his presence deepened in quiet ways, her fear grew in equal measure. At night, when he walked her to the door of her apartment without crossing the threshold, when he left her alone with the echo of what might have been said, if either of them had dared to say it, Maya felt the pull of something both radiant and ruinous. She told herself she was mistaking relief for affection, that survival always made saviors out of convenient figures, and that when the scaffolding came down, she would be left facing the same raw sky she had always known. Lucas, meanwhile, waged his own private war against instinct, watching the woman he protected learn to breathe again, and understanding with clinical terror that the fortress he had built around his heart had begun to accommodate her shape without his consent. He told himself he was only restoring an imbalance, only returning what the world had taken too roughly, but the lie grew thinner with every moment he stood, too close to her without touching, and every moment he watched the tension in her shoulders soften in his presence. One evening when rain pressed against the city like a held breath and Maya's building lost power on her block alone, Lucas arrived with a flashlight and a bag of candles he never lit, sitting beside her on the cold stairwell as tenants filtered past in confused silhouettes. They spoke about nothing important about childhood fears and the taste of burnt coffee and the strange ways people learned to disappear inside routine, but beneath every word lay a shared awareness that they were seated at the boundary between what they were pretending to be and what they were becoming. When he finally stood to leave, Maya caught his sleeve without thinking, her fingers trembling against the fabric of his coat with an urgency she did not yet trust. He froze not because he feared her touch, but because he feared what answering it would unlock in him. They stared at one another in the half-dark of the stairwell, the city muted behind walls that could not quite contain the moment swelling between them. Maya released him before either of them crossed a line. Their lives were not yet prepared to redraw, but the space where her hand had been lingered like a wound that had just learned what it meant to be felt. From that night forward, love ceased to be an abstraction either of them could dismiss. It was present in the way he waited before calling her name, in the way she began to look for his car, in reflections without admitting she was doing it, in the way their silences grew heavy rather than empty. They did not yet say the word that would have made the shape of it undeniable, but the city had already begun to notice the gravity between them, and Maya understood with the clarity of someone who had lived through too many consequences that protection once offered and accepted was the first irreversible act of intimacy. The scandal did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with a headline on Maya Carter's phone at 6:47 in the morning while her mother still slept, and the city outside the window pretended it had not noticed the small private world about to be torn open, and for one suspended breath, she did not understand that the words on the screen were meant to name her until the comments began to load beneath them in cruel, unfiltered waves. Billionaire CEO, linked to former diner waitress in secret relationship. The article read the phrasing, sharp and deliberate engineered to cut in exactly the places it knew would bleed fastest. And by the time Maya's hands started to shake, she had already been reduced to a silhouette in a story that belonged to everyone but her. The first photograph showed her outside the hospital, with Lucas cropped so closely that the context of his presence might as well have been a lie. The second showed her entering the black car the night she had been fired. The framing perfect for implication, the third showed them in the stairwell during the block blackout, her hand on his sleeve frozen into evidence of a confession she had never made. By 8 a.m., the story had leapt from gossip blogs to mainstream outlets scrubbed clean of its most vulgar guesses and repackaged as a tale of ambition and leverage played out across class lines. And by 9 o'clock, the word gold digger had trended beneath her name, with a velocity that made the world feel suddenly too fast to outrun. Maya did not cry at first. She moved through the apartment mechanically feeding her mother soft answers she did not hear, and swallowing down nausea that felt less physical than existential. When the hospital called to inform her that visiting hours were being restricted due to press interference, Maya understood with a clarity that split her open that the private space where she had learned to survive was no longer hers to defend. By noon, someone had posted her high school yearbook photo beside a screenshot of Atlas Group stock numbers, as if the two existed in a single moral ledger, and strangers who had never felt her pulse under their fingers or watched her count pills at dawn began to write long, confident explanations of who she was and what she wanted. Her phone rang with numbers that did not leave messages, and the silence they left behind felt louder than any threat could have been. When she stepped outside for the first time that day, reporters were already on the sidewalk, their questions polished into weapons that looked gentle until they struck, asking her how long the affair had been going on, whether she had negotiated money for intimacy, whether she felt guilty about manipulating a grieving billionaire for her own family's benefit. Maya stopped in the doorway, frozen between the instinct to run and the instinct to scream until solid hands settled on her shoulders from behind, and the world shifted just enough for her to breathe again. Lucas did not face the reporters with the fury they expected. He faced them with the calm of a man who had already decided what he would sacrifice. He told them there was no affair to exploit and no transaction to dissect, that Maya Carter had done nothing but receive protection. He had offered freely, and that any further intrusion into her life would be met with legal consequence without restraint. The press surged anyway, as if denial were merely another ingredient to be cooked down into spectacle, and the sound of their voices followed the car all the way to the bridge before falling away into distance. Inside the car, Maya finally spoke in a voice that did not feel like her own, and told him that everything he touched turned into glass. Around her reflecting damage, she would be the one to bleed for. He tried to answer, but she cut him off, not because she wanted silence, but because she did not trust herself to survive whatever comfort might follow. The next wave came at the diner, where she had already lost her job, the owner giving interviews about betrayal and liability, as if she had ever been anything but disposable labor to him. And by afternoon, her landlord refused to extend even the brief mercy he had once granted, without charging additional penalties for media attention. At Jonah's school, a group of parents demanded emergency review of his scholarship on the grounds of moral reputational risk, a phrase that arrived at Maya's ears with the cold precision of a verdict that would not bother to learn her story before pronouncing it unworthy. She stood in the hallway outside the principal's office while her son faced shame he did not know how to understand yet, and the guilt of having brought her own public erasure down on his small private life almost collapsed her where she stood. The evening found her once more at the hospital, this time barred by temporary security from reaching her mother's floor, as cameras flashed against the glass like accusation made visible. And when she finally slid down onto a bench in the lobby with her head in her hands, she felt smaller than she had since childhood taught her how to fold. Lucas arrived hours later with shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the sudden comprehension of what it meant to love someone into danger. He tried to apologize, but Maya did not want apology. She wanted undoing, and undoing was beyond both of them now. She told him in a voice worn thin by the day that she had never asked to be saved by a man powerful enough to destroy the shape of her anonymity, and that what he had imagined as protection had become a target she could not outrun. Lucas listened without defense and understood in the rawest way that love once public became a blade as double-edged as any loyalty he had ever wielded. Inside the hospital, her mother's condition deteriorated beneath the stress of disruption machines, answering to new rhythms that forced doctors to make faster decisions than anyone preferred, and Maya moved through informed consent forms with hands that shook too much to sign cleanly. Jonah arrived with red eyes and defiant anger that tried and failed to disguise fear. And when he demanded to know why the world had suddenly decided they were a story instead of a family, Maya found she had no answer that would not also be a betrayal of the hope she still did not know how to bury. Somewhere in the layered turbulence of that night, the board at Atlas Group convened without Lucas present and began to speak in the language of distance they knew best, discussing reputational containment and shareholder reassurance, as if the emotional detritus scattered in Maya's path were environmental rather than human. By the time the meeting ended, the press had already framed the narrative in lines so rigid they would be difficult to bend back toward truth, and phrases like strategic distraction and consensual influence traded hands with cold efficiency. Lucas stood with Maya in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and watched reporters take turns speculating on her character as if it were a commodity they could audit in public. And for the first time since the accident that had once broken him, he felt the same helpless rage claw up through old scars with no respect for time or consequence. He made a decision then that would cost him far more than stock prices ever could, but before he could name it aloud, Maya withdrew from his grasp with a softness that cut deeper than any anger she had thrown at him all day. She told him she could not be the weakness his enemies sharpened themselves against, that she could not allow her mother to become collateral in a war of narratives she had never agreed to fight. When he tried to argue, she shook her head, tears finally breaking free, as if the dam holding them back had simply yielded under cumulative weight rather than a single fracture. Love had not asked her for permission to arrive, and now survival demanded the same permission to let it go. She left the hospital alone that night through a side entrance, meant for staff and families who did not make headlines. And as she stepped into the rain that had begun again without regard for human thresholds, Maya understood with aching clarity that the world had exposed the very thing she had spent her life protecting, the quiet, fragile center where wanting lived, and in doing so, it had forced her to choose between the man she was beginning to love and the family she had always loved first. The truth came to Maya Carter not through Lucas, not through the press, and not through any of the violent headlines that still pulsed across the city like an open wound, but through an old woman in the corner of the hospital cafeteria who recognized her face before Maya ever recognized her voice. Maya had gone there because she could no longer sit still in waiting rooms, where every sound of wheels and footsteps made her chest seize, and because the side entrance she had used to escape the cameras led her past a place that still pretended the world was normal with plastic plants and burnt coffee. The woman watched her for a long time before speaking long enough for Maya to feel again that uncomfortable sensation of being seen without knowing why. When the woman finally said her name, Maya turned in shock, already preparing herself for another stranger who believed they knew her story. But the woman did not mention billionaires or scandal. She said Elena used to bring her lunch when she couldn't afford it. Maya's breath caught. No one outside her family ever spoke about her mother that way. The woman's name was Ruth. She had worked the night shift at a diner in Hartford nearly 30 years earlier, back when Maya's mother had still been learning how to balance exhaustion with grace. Ruth told her she had once watched Elena slip $20 beneath the coffee cup of a construction worker who had walked in, shivering and left without eating because pride was heavier than hunger for men like that. Elena had not known his name then. She had never told Maya that story. Ruth smiled, as if remembering a piece of shared weather, and said that same man came back 2 weeks later with bandages on his hands and a box of envelopes he had convinced the neighborhood to fill. When Elena collapsed on her way home, after her shift, Ruth said it was that man who raised the money that kept the hospital from turning her away. Maya felt the room tilt. That could not be true. Elena had always spoken about that year as if she had survived it alone by willpower and stubbornness. The way she spoke about most things that had nearly broken her. Ruth leaned closer across the small table and asked Maya if her mother had ever told her about a woman named Margaret Blackwood. The name struck Maya with a force she did not understand, until Ruth explained it in fragments that began to slide into place with terrifying clarity. Margaret Blackwood had been another waitress on the morning shift, quieter than most, with eyes that carried too much future for the room she worked in. She had a small boy with her sometimes, when she couldn't find anyone to watch him. A boy who drew buildings on napkins and counted windows like he was learning a language adults had not yet taught him. When Margaret's husband died in a workplace accident, the diner had become both her livelihood and her refuge. It was Elena who taught her how to ask the right questions at the right desks to keep utilities on without begging. It was Elena who gave her groceries when Margaret pretended she had already eaten. And when Margaret lost her savings to a landlord who disappeared overnight with half the tenant's deposits, it was Elena who reminded her that people could still be held together without contracts. Maya realized then that she was gripping the edge of the table hard enough to ache. Ruth finished softly, almost as if she feared the conclusion might shatter if spoken too loudly. That boy was Lucas. Maya left the cafeteria without knowing how she managed to stand or walk or breathe. The corridors blurred into meaningless lines as the truth swelled inside her with a gravity that rearranged everything she had believed about coincidence and choice. Lucas had not chosen her at random. He had not chosen her only because she had endured his test without breaking. He had chosen her because her mother's kindness had once altered the entire trajectory of his life. Because without Elena, the empire he built might never have existed to begin with. When Maya reached her mother's bedside, she felt suddenly much younger than she had that morning, like a child approaching a story that would rewrite the shape of her inheritance. Elena was awake but weak, her eyes dull with medications and fatigue. And when Maya asked her about Margaret Blackwood, her mother closed her eyes as if the past had simply been waiting for permission to become real again. Elena told her about the construction worker named Sam, who had organized the fundraiser, and how she had never known what became of Margaret or her son after they moved. She had always wondered whether the boy remembered drawing windows on napkins or the way the diner smelled like old oil and possibility at the same time. Maya told her mother who Lucas was now, told her everything in a rush that made tears finally come without shame, and Elena listened with the slow wonder of someone being shown a mirror they had never expected to face again. She whispered that she had never done anything remarkable, that people had helped her because sometimes that was simply what tired people did for each other. Maya shook her head. It had been remarkable enough to echo for decades. That night, Lucas sat alone in his office, surrounded by screens that measured damage in numbers and projections, trying to decide how much of his life he would have to dismantle to reach the apology he owed Maya when his assistant brought the message that she was on her way up. For a moment he did not trust it. When Maya walked into the room, she did not look angry. She did not look afraid. She looked as if a great weight had shifted inside her and resettled into a different shape. She told him what Ruth had told her. She told him what her mother had confirmed. Lucas sat down because his body no longer recognized distance as something that could hold him upright. The truth fell between them without spectacle and without negotiation, binding their pasts into a single line. Neither of them had known they were stepping along. He told her then about the boy who counted windows and the woman who had kept him alive with nothing but stubborn generosity and a belief that people could be woven together by acts too small to notice at the time. He told her that when he saw Maya endure his test without corrosion, he had seen Elena in her again and felt the same unbearable mixture of gratitude and obligation break open inside his chest. Maya listened in silence and finally understood the ache she had not been able to name in him from the beginning. She told him what that knowledge changed and what it did not. It did not undo the scandal. It did not resurrect her lost privacy. It did not heal the injuries that had already landed, but it did something more dangerous. It anchored their connection in a story that preceded desire and would outlast it if they let it. They stood there together, suspended between everything they now owed the past and everything the present demanded they sacrifice. Maya told Lucas she still had to leave, not as a rejection of the truth they shared, but because the weight of it now extended behind her into generations that demanded she protect what remained of her family without hesitation. Lucas did not argue this time. He only asked her to let him carry the story with her, rather than before her as a shield. She did not answer directly. She touched the edge of his desk the way she once touched his sleeve in the stairwell, and said that some inheritances were too large to wear all at once. Then she walked out of the tower for the last time she could imagine as herself leaving behind. Not just a man she was beginning to love, but a destiny braided so tightly into her blood that escape would never again mean erasure. Maya did not leave Lucas in a moment of anger, nor in a storm of accusations. Dramatic enough to justify the fracture that followed, she left him in the quiet way people leave when they have already exhausted every argument their heart is brave enough to make, and discovered that love alone is sometimes not strong enough to protect everyone it touches at once. She packed her life into 3 bags before dawn, while the city still pretended it was untouched by consequence folding clothes she no longer recognized as symbols of who she used to be, and pausing too long over the one black dress she had worn the night everything began to collapse. Elena slept fitfully in the hospital. Jonah's room stood half empty with boxes stacked against the wall, and the silence in the apartment felt like forgiveness she was not yet ready to accept from herself. She left a note on the kitchen table for Jonah, written in careful letters that tried and failed to disguise their trembling, telling him they were going somewhere safer where people could not follow them with words sharp enough to draw blood somewhere his name would not arrive, already bent by rumor. By the time the sky turned pale with the first promise of morning, Maya closed the door on a life that had only just begun to resemble a future, and stepped into a version of herself that lived entirely in the act of leaving. Lucas learned she was gone, not from her voice but from the emptiness her absence created in every place he expected to find her. He went first to the apartment and found it stripped of the small, ordinary weights that had made it real then, to the hospital where Elena's room had been reassigned, then to the school where Jonah's file now carried the word withdrawn with bureaucratic finality. Each destination confirmed the same truth in a different language. That afternoon, he finally found the note she had left at his office, with the security guard who had watched her walk in without hesitation and walk back out without looking behind her. The note did not explain everything. It explained only enough to ensure he would not chase her with the arrogance of a man who believes love entitles him to repair what he has not been permitted to break. She wrote that she loved him not as a confession meant to anchor him, but as a truth she needed to release in order to survive it, and that she could not be the place where his enemies aimed their arguments, or where her son learned the cost of being visible before he learned the security of being safe. She asked him not to follow her, not because she doubted his sincerity, but because she trusted it enough to fear what it would demand of them both. Lucas stood in his office with the city spread beneath him like a map of everything he could still command, and understood with brutal clarity how little of it mattered without the one person he was no longer permitted to reach for. Maya moved west with no ceremony, choosing a town without memory or spectacle, where headlines did not arrive already knowing her name. The coastal air tasted like distance and anonymity in equal measure, and the small rental house near the water held just enough promise to feel temporary rather than lost. Elena's condition stabilized into something fragile but possible. Jonah enrolled in a public school where no one cared who his mother used to be, and Maya found work in a seaside cafe where her past did not arrive ahead of her, and the only currency she was required to perform in was the rhythm of coffee cups and weather. At night, when the ocean shifted in its sleep and Jonah laughed with new friends whose parents had not yet learned to fear reputation, Maya allowed herself to breathe in ways she had nearly forgotten were possible. Yet even as the days settled into a tentative shape of peace, Lucas remained with her in the negative spaces between moments in the way she still turned, when a tall shadow crossed a doorway, in the way her body recognized the absence of his protection. As a cold draft she pretended not to feel. Lucas did not follow her as she asked, but he did not vanish from her life either, not entirely. Quiet protections continued to arrive without signatures. A scholarship fund at Jonah's new school appeared with no donor listed. A specialist consultation for Elena was approved with an efficiency that felt familiar even through its anonymity. Once a painting appeared in the cafe window for sale at a price that paid half their rent in a single afternoon, and the artist introduced himself as Daniel, a name Maya recognized, without understanding how. She did not confront these gestures. She accepted them with the discipline of someone who knows resistance would not make them cease, and gratitude would only invite questions she was not yet ready to answer. For Lucas, the absence was not eased by work or strategy or the machinery of keeping scandals contained. Without Maya, every success felt blunted. Every triumph sounded like applause in a room where the one person he wanted to hear it from would never be seated. His board praised his decisiveness after he reshaped the company's public narrative, but none of them knew the decision he had not unmade was letting the woman he loved choose survival over proximity. At night, he returned to an apartment that no longer held even the illusion of refuge. And sometimes he stood at the window, counting lights the way he once counted windows. On diner napkins as a child, a habit that had returned uninvited in the wake of loss. Months passed with the merciless patience of time that neither consoles nor condemns. Jonah grew into the edges of his new life with an ease that both healed and hurt Maya at once, because each new attachment made the old world recede another inch beyond reach. Elna recovered enough to walk to the porch in the evenings and speak about the ocean with the wary wonder of someone encountering another chance. Disguised as scenery, Maya learned the rhythms of her new town, the tides, the storms, the way strangers became familiar without asking for proof. Yet even as stability rebuilt itself under her hands, the ache of separation matured into something quieter and more dangerous than grief. It became a question that did not demand an answer, but watched her from behind every decision. Lucas learned through indirect channels that she was safe, that she was no longer hunted by a narrative neither of them had chosen, and safety became the only justification he allowed himself for staying absent from the life he had once nearly reached. On a cold evening near the end of winter, Maya stood on the shore, watching Jonah skip stones across water that did not recognize the weight of his fears, and for the first time since she left, she allowed herself to whisper Lucas's name without flinching. Love, she realized, had not followed her as a rescuer this time. It had followed her as a memory waiting for the shape of the future to decide whether it would be permitted to return. Lucas did not decide to burn his kingdom in a single dramatic moment. He decided it the way men decide truths they have been avoiding. Slowly at first, and then all at once, as the cost of keeping the crown became heavier than the cost of letting it fall. The months after Maya's departure taught him what dominance without refuge felt like, how power multiplied noise, but did not multiply, meaning how boardrooms echoed, even when filled with voices that praised him. He rose earlier, worked later, allowed the machinery of Atlas Group to run with clinical efficiency, while something human inside him quietly starved. The scandal that had once threatened to consume him cooled into a narrative the public could digest, reframed into a familiar pattern of ambitious woman and insulated man, a story the world preferred, because it preserved the idea that wealth always returned to order. Lucas let them have that lie because correcting it would invite Maya back into a fire she had chosen to escape. Yet the lie sat in him like a broken shard, sharp enough to cut every time he moved. The board pressed him to expand into defense technology, a pivot that promised exponential growth and reputational gravitas. And on paper it made sense in the ruthless language Atlas had always spoken. Lucas approved the preliminary reviews without protest, then spent an entire night alone in his office, reading the impact analyses that reduced entire communities to risk curves. Near dawn, he closed the files and finally understood that the company had become a mirror he no longer recognized himself in. The morning of the vote, he walked into the boardroom without his usual briefing folder and told them he would not authorize the pivot, not because it was unprofitable, but because it was corrosive. The room stilled, surprised not by his refusal, but by the tone of it stripped of negotiation. He spoke then of the waitress who had once fed a dying company, with nothing but stubborn generosity, of the woman who had taught their future CEO that dignity could be built without defense contracts, and dismantled with equal speed of the boy who had counted windows while waiting for his mother's shift to end, and learned that the world was not made of glass, but of decisions. The directors exchanged glances that carried both concern and calculation, and when one of them accused Lucas of projecting sentiment onto corporate governance, he felt no anger rise to answer it, only clarity. He told them he would resign as CEO if the vote moved forward. Silence stretched thin as wire. Within an hour, the market learned that Atlas Group was facing an internal fracture, and within 2 hours the fracture had become a headline that screamed volatility. Investors demanded reassurance. Analysts sharpened their language. Lucas stood before cameras he had once commanded and said that he would not lead a company into a future he could no longer stand behind, and that the wealth built on erasing people was not wealth he would continue to shepherd. When they asked whether this decision was influenced by his personal life, he answered that every decision was influenced by who a man was, when there was no applause, and offered no further explanation. By evening, the board accepted his resignation with a statement that tried to sound mutual and failed. The stock dipped, rallied, dipped again, and Lucas walked out of the tower that had defined him for 20 years, carrying nothing but a small box of personal effects that weighed less than the questions he left behind. He did not feel relief immediately. He felt weightless in the wrong direction, like a structure that had lost gravity before gaining ground. That night he sat alone in the apartment he was preparing to sell, and watched the city rearrange itself without seeking his consent for the first time since he had learned how to command it. Meanwhile, far from screens that translated consequence into charts, Maya learned of his resignation through a brief mention on the cafe's muted television as she wiped down the counter near closing. The anchor's voice framed it as an unexpected pivot, fueled by ideological conflict, and Maya felt her breath stutter before she could stop it. She told herself it meant nothing to her now, that a man shedding a crown was still a man. She had chosen to leave for reasons that had not changed with his title. Yet her hands trembled as she closed the register, and she did not trust the tremor to be meaningless. That night she stood on the porch, listening to the ocean move in its dark certainty, and wondered what the shape of sacrifice looked like when it was no longer demanded by crisis but chosen by clarity. Lucas spent the following weeks dismantling the scaffolding of a life built around permanence, selling the apartment, stepping away from private protections. He no longer believed he had earned refusing the offers that arrived immediately from rivals, eager to inherit both his networks and his reputation. He redirected the majority of his personal wealth into a trust that could not be reclaimed without unanimous consent from a board of educators, social workers, and community advocates. He himself did not control. The lawyers called it reckless, the advisors called it a performance. Lucas called it the first honest ledger he had kept in decades. On the day the trust was finalized, he visited the old diner that no longer employed Maya and ordered coffee he barely tasted. The owner did not recognize him at first, but when he did, his expression shifted into something complicated and cautious, as if weighing whether regret had currency. Lucas left 100 on the counter and walked out without waiting for absolution. In the small coastal town where Maya had begun to rebuild a life she did not have to justify a rumor, arrived before Lucas ever could. Someone had read about the resignation and attached it to her name with the same ease the world attached blame. And by the time a stranger asked whether she had destroyed a titan with a smile, Maya knew silently that detachment could not shield her forever from the ripples of what they had begun. She did not defend herself. She did not deny it either. She simply said that some men destroyed themselves when they finally learned how to listen. That night, she dreamed of Lucas standing on a bridge that no longer demanded anything from him, and she woke with a longing that felt like both an ache and a permission. Lucas did not go to her immediately after he left Atlas. He understood too well the difference between renunciation performed for an audience and renunciation that remade a life. He waited until waiting no longer felt like cowardice disguised as caution, until the trust operated without his intervention, and the city no longer turned its face toward him with daily speculation. When he finally drove west, the road did not feel like escape. It felt like alignment delayed a line he had refused to draw, until the distance between what he had been and what he wanted to be could no longer be mistaken for growth. As he crossed state lines and daylight thinned into the salt air, he had never learned to inhabit. Lucas carried nothing with him that he would not be willing to set down at her feet if she asked. No crown, no leverage, only the truth that love demanded, the courage to arrive without armor. Lucas arrived in the coastal town without announcement, and without the armor that once made his presence feel like an event, rather than a person parking the borrowed truck 2 blocks away from the cafe, because he did not trust his resolve to survive the distance if he allowed himself to shorten it too quickly. Walking the rest of the way with nothing but salt wind in his lungs, and the knowledge that whatever awaited him at the end of that street would not belong to him unless it chose to. Maya saw him first not as Lucas Blackwood, former titan of glass towers and markets, but as a tall man standing uncertainly across the road, as if waiting for permission from a life that had never learned how to grant it easily. And something in her chest shifted with a recognition, so deep it bypassed caution entirely. For a long moment, they only looked at one another through the cafe window, while the world continued around them, without apology waves, collapsing into water, and customers trading small talk that did not know it had become irrelevant, to 2 lives finally intersecting again. When Maya stepped outside, the bell over the door still rang like a question neither of them immediately answered. He did not apologize first. He did not explain the resignation or the trust or the money redirected, like confession disguised as integrity. He simply told her he had come without a crown and without a plan, and that he would leave as easily as he had arrived if she asked him to. The simplicity of it broke something open in her that no grand declaration ever could have. She told him she had built a life here stitch by fragile stitch, and that she would not trade its quiet for another storm, even one lined with gold. He told her he had not come to take her anywhere. He had come to stand where she already was, and to learn what it meant to remain. They sat on the low seawall that night with space between them that neither tried to close too quickly, speaking about Elena's recovery and Jonah's growing certainty in a world that did not ask him to perform survival every morning, speaking about the trust Lucas had placed into hands that were not his and the way it terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever had. When Maya asked him what he wanted, now that he was free of the machinery he had once served, Lucas answered with a quiet honesty that felt like a vow delivered without ritual. He said he wanted to learn how to give without ownership and how to stay without leverage. The next weeks unfolded not as a reunion defined by rushing, but as a courtship rebuilt on smaller truths. Lucas worked at the cafe without announcement or pride-scrubbing tables, and burning coffee until the customers learned his name without knowing its former weight. And Maya watched the way he learned the rhythms of a life that did not bend around him out of fear or flattery, but out of mutual dependence. Jonah tested him with the unfiltered scrutiny of a child who no longer trusted gestures that arrived wrapped in spectacle, and Lucas met every challenge without insisting on his place-fixing bikes and listening to stories that wandered without conclusion, understanding that trust given without terms was trust that could withstand time. Elena met him on the porch one quiet afternoon with the eyes of a woman who had once fed his mother without knowing she was feeding a future. And when she placed her hand over his and told him that kindness never belonged to the account, it was deposited into only to the hands that chose to pass it on. Lucas felt the last rigid line of inheritance finally soften into something that could move. The scandal that once devoured Maya's life did not vanish from the world, but it lost its appetite when it could no longer feed on reaction, rebranding itself into something smaller and less certain as people shifted their attention toward easier outrage elsewhere. The cafe became a gathering place, not for spectacle, but for stories that traded quietly in gratitude, and the town learned Maya and Lucas as fixtures rather than headlines, as the woman who remembered every customer's order, and the man who once counted windows and now counted tides with the same patient wonder. The trust Lucas built did not bear his name, and the programs it funded did not carry his signature, but their effects traveled far enough to brush this small town in indirect ways, as new scholarships arrived without explanation, and a community clinic found its debts erased by a donor who asked only that the work continue without banners. Maya recognized the shape of those gifts without confronting them, as such understanding that some acts of love were made weaker when dragged into light too quickly. On the evening the cafe closed early, for the first time in months, Maya and Lucas walked down the shore with Jonah between them, throwing stones that skipped farther than he expected, laughing with the effortless abundance that comes from living without a scoreboard. When Jonah ran ahead to challenge the waves alone for a moment, Lucas stopped and told Maya what he had never said in the language the world once required of him. He said he loved her not because she had changed his life, but because she had refused to let him buy the right to remain in it. Maya answered not with a promise of permanence, but with a truth grown patient enough to survive uncertainty. She said she loved him because he had learned how to kneel without feeling diminished and how to stand without demanding a stage. They did not seal that moment with a kiss meant to announce resolution to an imagined audience. They sealed it with a long look shared at equal height, and the knowledge that what endured between them would not be defended by spectacle but by repetition. Months later, on a cold, wet night that resembled the one where everything had once begun, a young man entered the cafe near closing with paint on his hands, and exhaustion in his eyes ordered the cheapest coffee and nothing else, and counted the bills in his wallet with the same careful arithmetic. Maya had once performed under the gaze of strangers who never noticed the courage hidden inside that ritual. When Maya brought him the check, the total read 0 with a note beneath it, written in steadier ink than the hands that once penned it, for her telling him someone had already covered his night and asking only that he do the same when the chance arrived. The young man's eyes filled in the quiet way gratitude often chose, and when he left he did not know he was stepping into a lineage older than money and more durable than any bank. Lucas placed 2 bills in the shared jar without ceremony and watched Maya slip the note into her pocket with the careful reverence of someone who understood what it meant to carry a story rather than possess it. Outside, the rain softened into something that felt less like judgment and more like blessing. And as they locked the cafe together, Lucas felt the last of the old weight burn away from his hands. Some tips were never meant to be counted. Some were meant to be continued. And in the quiet circulation of kindness that had passed from Elna to Margaret, and from Margaret to Lucas, and from Lucas to Maya, and now outward again, without signatures or witnesses, the kingdom he had once burned found its truest shape not in towers of glass, but in a small warm room where love paid forward did not ask for return. If this story touched something quiet inside you, if you felt Maya's fear when the world turned her into a headline, or Lucas's courage when he chose to walk away from a crown for the sake of a single unguarded truth, then you already understand what this channel exists for. These stories are not just about billionaires and waitresses or scandal and redemption. They are about the invisible moments when dignity survives, when kindness changes direction, and when love arrives, not as possession, but as permission to become more human. Somewhere tonight, someone is counting coins for coffee. Someone is choosing between pride and hunger. Someone is standing at the edge of a life they are afraid to lose, and even more afraid to want. And somewhere else, someone still believes that one small act can echo farther than anyone expects. If you believe that too, then you are already part of this story. Before you scroll away, take a moment and tell us where you are watching from. A city, a small town, a kitchen late at night, a break room between shifts. Your comment might be the one that reminds someone else they are not alone. If you felt the love between Maya and Lucas grow not because of power, but because of protection and choice, tap the like button so YouTube knows to share this kind of story with more hearts that are still open. If you want to stay with us for the next chapter of kindness, sacrifice, forbidden love, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's story is already waiting for you, and it carries a different kind of miracle. And if you know someone who is struggling quietly, someone who works hard, loves deeply, and never asks for enough, share this video with them. Not because it's perfect, but because it might remind them that their life matters more than any rumor, any label, or any headline ever could. Finally, drop a comment below and tell us this. Have you ever experienced a moment where one act of kindness changed your life forever? A stranger who helped when no one else would? A choice that cost you comfort but gave you peace? A love that arrived when you were not looking for it? Your story might become the next one we tell. This is not just a channel. It is a quiet place where stories keep the light on for each other. Until next time, take care of your heart, pass the kindness forward, and remember that sometimes the smallest tip is the one that changes everything.